thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Scott Robinson, a professor in finance here at NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate. I'm also director of the REIT Center. It's my great pleasure today to host this conversation on renewable energy. I think the timing is perfect with everything that's been going on in the digital economy. And of course, all the focus on ESG, especially both the E and the S. With us today are some folks who play well across all those ecosystems. Since I'm not very good at introductions, why don't I pass the ball to the speakers to give their backgrounds. We'll get more into the conversation and how this is going to evolve. But we've got about an hour to talk about renewable energy, to talk about microgrids, to talk about the ecosystems where you guys play in, what the tax landscape looks like, what the pricing and cost structure looks like, what the competitive field looks like. But I think importantly too, what the growth landscape looks like for you guys. We're talking about an acceleration into a digital economy, right? And so for my students, for those of us in the real estate space, I would say that primarily bakes around data centers, cell towers, things of that nature, but also increasingly, controlled environment agriculture. There's a couple companies in that space just went public through a SPAC. And so we're seeing a lot more focus on that, not only because of the sustainability aspect, water usage, electricity usage, but also disrupting the agricultural supply chain. So there's just a whole focus on ESG. And so, as we were saying before we got started here, to some respect, sustainability has been a little bit of a backwater within the real estate space, but I think all of that has changed in the past, 12, 18, 24 months. So I'm excited to have this conversation. Our students are primarily focused on traditional real estate, but they've been very focused on learning and understanding the digital economy and digital infrastructure. And so that's a great send-off for today's conversation. Why don't we kick it off with introduction from Julian, and you can talk a little bit about your background and Scale Microgrid Solution.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Scott. My name is Julian Torres. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Scale Microgrid Solutions. We are I'm going to throw some slides up here, but we're a vertically integrated distributed energy company, and we're based in Ridgewood, New Jersey, with offices Denver, Northern and Southern California, Boston, and in New York City, and Lower Manhattan. Give me one moment. So just a brief word on Scale Microgrid Solutions. If I can get to the right slide. There we go. So we are, like I said, a vertically integrated distributed energy platform. We're a team of energy experts. The business has been in operation since 2016 and was founded by a core group of individuals that had tremendous experience in distributed energy, primarily through gas-fired dispatchable solutions. They took that expertise and decided to focus on adding resiliency and adding renewable energy components to their solution. And by doing so, brought in the ability to deliver cost savings. So the business really is bifurcated in two, between capital solutions, which is a business line that rolls up to me, and microgrid solutions. Our microgrid solutions, as the name suggests, focused on providing customers with bespoke custom microgrids and modular microgrids, which we have productized in effect. On the capital solutions side of the business, we offer financing and we offer the ability to have customers engage with us on energy savings agreements over a long period of time, which spreads out the cost of capital to implement a microgrid. The focus areas for us on the capital solution side are more expansive than the internal development under the Microgrid Solutions umbrella. We're looking broadly at distributed energy, which includes everything from community solar to electrical vehicle and transportation energy infrastructure. We serve a broad array of industries that reflects the breadth of the end user base that microgrids support, from commercial applications to municipal applications, various food and agriculture businesses, and hospitality, and everything in between. A microgrid, as we define it, is a facility located behind the meter installation of various generating components as laid out on this diagram. We have the ability to implement solutions with solar, battery storage, and dispatchable generators that can be fired from either gas or diesel energy. We can operate in parallel with the grid, but most importantly, our microgrids operate in an island mode, which allows the host facility to be powered when the grid is unavailable. The features of our product differentiate from what is available on the market in many ways, primarily along verticals of resilience, economics, and environmental impact. As you can see, our microgrid solution and microgrids broadly defined often offer a lot more to a customer than either a simple backup generator or standalone solar. And we can get into a lot of these features during the broader discussion. But it's very important that in some markets, all three items can be delivered to a customer, or depending on the customer's needs, we can emphasize the value of the resilience or the cost savings or the reduction in CO2 impact in the customer's operations. So with that, I'll conclude our introduction on Scale Microgrid Solutions, and I look forward to participating in the panel. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Julian. That's a great overview, much better than I ever could do on what renewable and microgrids are. Aaron and Josh, you guys play in a similar field, but I think a little bit different, and also interesting enough, some form or another, Hannon's been around since the early 80s, right? Josh, you want to tell us a little bit about Hannah Armstrong?
Sure. So good afternoon. Thanks for inviting us. Appreciate, Scott and Matt, all the work you've done behind the scenes putting this on. My name is Josh Garrett. I'm a director on the structured investment team at Hannah Armstrong. I guess just briefly, within my corner of our business, I lead transactions in the distributed solar space. So it's primarily community solar these days, as well as commercial scale rooftop solar projects. The community solar projects are small utility scale sites with about 300 to 1,000 residential subscribers, whereas the commercial scale projects are sited on roofs and carports at places like Target or office buildings. So those projects increasingly also have a storage component. I think it's similar to what Julian was just describing, having multiple components on a smart grid. We see the same change in the market towards multiple components and almost offering energy as a service. In addition to the solar component and storage, I also evaluate other distributed energy resources for investment opportunities, many of which could be cited on a microgrid as an additional part of the energy ecosystem for a site, like electric vehicle charging is a good current example. And I mean, Aaron, let me know if I can throw up the slides now, or think it makes sense to just jump into that, or you want to do your overview?
Yeah, sure. I can give a quick background and then jump into a couple slides and then turn it back to you.
Cool.
So my name is Aaron McCrady. I have been with Hannon about 6 years. I am a director on our credit investment team, focused a bit more on debt products. And I started my career in the power plant development business, and then have more recently, at Hannon, shifted to financial services and more focused on the investment side. I lead our land transactions. We are the largest private landowner under solar projects. So we purchase, we think we have over 35,000 acres of land owned under solar projects, and then those are leased back to the projects themselves. Solar takes a tremendous amount of land, so there's a good connection here with real estate, not just in the traditional building sense, but in the land as it relates to solar. And then I also lead our ecological restoration business, which is maybe a bit off topic, but when it comes to climate change and climate change investing, cleaning up our waterways and making our cities more flood resilient is going to be a large element of the impacts of climate change that we'll have to figure out how to mitigate, and will be a growing market. Josh,
those are key words for us in New York, and I'm sure those in Florida as well.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, Battery Park. I mean, here in Annapolis, the downtown floods regularly, so it's a big issue. Josh, feel free to go to the next slide, if you will. So who is Hannah Armstrong? Hannah Armstrong is a publicly traded company. We are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We're the first US public company solely dedicated to investments in climate change. We believe that climate change is the largest investment opportunity of our lifetime. There are very few industries that will be affected as a result of lowering carbon emissions to mitigate the impact of global warming and climate change. We don't do any investments that are not carbon neutral or better. And we manage about $7 billion. We invest approximately, last year we did $1.9 million of investments every year. Hope to do the same or more this year. We focus on three primary areas of investing: behind the meter, which is many of the things that Julian just mentioned when it comes to energy efficiency, distributed, about energy storage. We also focus on grid connected, which includes onshore wind, solar land, and then some storage. And then, as I mentioned, some of the sustainable infrastructure investments that I work on includes ecological restoration and stormwater remediation. Our strategy is to focus on programmatic relationships. We tend to focus, if you see the graph on the right, we can cover transactions small to large. I think our smallest transaction is $200,000 and our largest is over 200 million. We are also, and I think our average transaction size is around $12 to $14 million, which is pretty small when you're doing, $1.9 billion a year. So we have to structure our business to do programmatic repeat transactions with core clients. We are permanent capital, as we're listed on as we're a public company. So we don't necessarily have a fund life. We don't need to exit in any particular time frame. So we can go longer tenor than private equity typically, and we can do smaller transactions than the traditional commercial bank market. We try to provide flexible capital solutions based on our clients. And then, as I mentioned, we're permanent capital. So that's how we compete sort of in the broader financial space. And this is just a little bit of a schematic based on some of the things Julian mentioned. Julian mentioned sort of behind the meter. If you think about a meter in your home or in a building, sort of everything leading up to that would be grid connected, and then everything the meter and beyond is behind the meter. We do a tremendous amount of energy efficiency. There have been a lot of technology improvements in lighting and heating, HVAC systems. All of those upgrades lower carbon and save customers money. There's tremendous opportunities in the broader built environment in buildings to, just changing all of the LED lights is a multi-billion-dollar problem that can drastically reduce carbon and save a a ton of money. So that's one theme. And then one other thing to mention, on the right, grid connected is wholesale pricing. And then on the left is more retail pricing. So that would be, on the left is more the customers who buy power. These are the Microsofts, the Amazons, any large buildings. Anybody who's a consumer of power has more control of how they use, consume, and generate power. And then on the right is more of the regulated utility element of the power market. And Josh, I think I'll turn it back over to you to talk about a couple of illustrative investments that we've made that I think would be helpful.
Sounds good. All right. Yep. So the next two slides are basically mini case studies for a cross-section of the asset classes that Taryn just enumerated. I'll spend a little bit more time on behind the meter for really the content today. The first on the left is a public-private partnership with the University of Iowa. And it's a pretty interesting deal that wraps energy and water services as well as improved resiliency into a single agreement with the University of Iowa. The energy side included upgrades to their on-site generation resources, which are integrated into the larger grid, but also provided a reduction of their use of the utility grid when prices were high, and backup power in the event that the broader grid was not available at certain times, especially for critical on-site loads of the university. The water system was similarly upgraded, and infrastructure that failed in actually a 2008 flooding, a real-world example, was upgraded to mitigate the impact a similar event would have in the future. The next investment on the right was one I worked on in my first year at Hannon, actually. This is another behind the meter investment. It's a single portfolio, but there's 200 sites here, which reflects, I think, the diversification benefits of distributed energy. It's a good example of that over a dozen states, I believe. So this has almost a mutual fund benefit by varying the locations, equipment, and contract counterparties. Briefly, the other two are a good illustration of the work we do and further diversification of our portfolio. So this goes from grid-connected utility-scale wind and solar projects, which can actually be, upwards of over $500 million of invested capital across an entire portfolio, and then some sustainable infrastructure, like Aaron spoke to. On the next slide, the first behind-the-meter example is even more diversified than the C&I portfolio I was mentioning. So this is a example of a single residential solar fund. Over the course of the past few years, we've invested in offhand probably 10 to 12 funds like this. And for any single fund like this $300 million investment here, there's approximately 15,000 customers for a given portfolio spread across the United States. The next behind the meter example is green real estate. So this is a C-PACE transaction, which I would highly encourage real estate folks to learn more about it. And you may actually know quite a bit more than I do for some of the people on this call. But this is an emerging option in many states that allows for a reduced rate on a portion of the financing for a commercial building related to sustainability upgrades. And then you can see the grid connected leases that Aaron mentioned. We actually, it's been moving quite a bit. I think he estimated 3,500. We've got 4,000 acres of land under approximately 700 megawatts of utility scale sites. And then another example of ecological restoration to the right of that focuses on specific ecosystems, and in this case, wetland and stream restoration. So I'll just jump over. I mean, Aaron, I think really hit how important carbon reduction is. It is a metric we look at for every single investment. We do not have any investments that add carbon to the ecosystem. They can have components that are, that have natural gas, for example, but it would be, within a broader portfolio that overall, or I should say, even a given project would be reducing carbon by being more efficient, having solar, having storage, other components that are reducing to the rest of the grid. So what this is, and you can see the calculation here, but I'll just summarize it further. It's a simple metric we created to illustrate the carbon reduction in tons of CO2 per $1,000 invested. So the example on the bottom left for onshore wind, a 1.5 carbon count for a wind project means that for every $1,000 we invest, 1.5 metric tons of CO2 are mitigated every year of our investment. So what's neat on the map in the bottom right is that you actually get our best carbon returns from investments that offset generation in states that otherwise use highly carbon intensive forms of generation. So this would be states that have more coal, things of that nature. And so the highest carbon counts you see are in the Texas, Iowa area. That's everything we wanted to hit on our prepared slides. So just jump out here.
I would say you guys collectively just gave our students a 101, a 201, and a 301 education. So I appreciate that. Look, one thing I want to back up a little bit as our students are preparing to graduate and enter into the workforce. One of the things we like to do is educate them on emerging trends and things evolving in the real estate space so they can affect change as they grow their careers, right? And so I think part of today's call is to educate them on the use of microgrids, as well as the use of the types and range of renewables that can be utilized by microgrids. But also, Josh, as you just pointed out, I love your carbon count. I want to come back to that. And we may follow up after this call even on that one. Coincidentally, both of you guys on your slides 4 really had a nice overview of the ecosystem. But I want to introduce Matt Kwatinetz, a friend and colleague of mine at NYU and also director of our urban center. I want him to join today's conversation. He has a past career at the New York EDC, where he was looking at bringing microgrids into the municipal landscape. Let's talk about that as one possible use of microgrids that we can kind of get into the commercial and residential side in greater detail, as well as maybe entertainment venues. Matt.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you to all the panelists for being here. This is really a who's who of some of the deepest energy work going on. We're really pleased to be able to introduce the students at NYU to all of your work. Scott and I were chatting as you were going through the presentations, and we were having the comment that this was all the way from beginning all the way to super advanced. So I want to step back just for a second and talk a little bit about how this is related to real estate and why we care, just for a second, to help you contextualize students what we're talking about here. On the one hand, we're seeing one of the biggest transformations of the economy that has happened since the Industrial Revolution. I'm not exaggerating or using hyperbole. I think it was said earlier, you're going to see a transformation of almost every industry here, real estate included. And from the real estate perspective, it's not only one thing changing. Part of it is how buildings are being built, and part of it is how buildings are being powered, and part of it is what amenities might be available to buildings that didn't exist before. And then on top of that, you have the response to resiliency, floods, all the different things that we're increasingly seeing as climate events happening. Very recently, in terms of New York's infrastructure planning, Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, really has jump-started a lot of reactions that we're having within New York City. And indeed, next week, on May 4th, we're going to be doing some work around the FDR, which ties into a lot of discoveries of how much flooding was going to happen here in New York as we move forward. And one of those things that we realized is there are certain infrastructure that's highly vulnerable to flooding, and in particular in Hunts Point in the Bronx, all along the East River on both sides of the river, and in Sunset Park, South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, as well. And so we started looking in New York at, well, when those floods happen, one of the things that occurs is all those properties get disconnected from the larger grid of power. And some of them are running really important functions, like bringing all the food into New York City. And so it was asked, well, we can't really fix the whole grid very easily or very quickly. And in fact, when we fix it, we're going to make it all renewable. So can we take an interim step of islanding these areas? And if you look back at one of the slides that was shown here, you can take certain areas and provide power that can exist even without the larger grid. And that's what we call backup power or standby power. That's the first step in imagining microgrids. How can we have power even when the grid isn't up? And it goes from there into a million different directions, including in New York, having commercial grids and also having grids that do renewable power into communities, and also having grids as an amenity to industrial parks to have cleaner power or consistent power. So there are certain areas in Staten Island that support all our data here in New York that were on their own grid. And so when the power went out in Superstorm Sandy, the power did not go out in those data centers because they had standby microgrids. So you can see, if you're a real estate owner, if you're a resident, if you're a developer, if you're thinking about infrastructure, all those areas, you're going to be really interested in thinking about, how should I look at power coming into the next century, really, the next 50 years? And in order to understand that, you have to start understanding behind the meter and the idea of whether or not you need a microgrid or can use it to increase the value of the real estate that you have. I'll give you one more example, and then I think we're going to jump into questions for the panelists. One more example is in Sunset Park, there's a lot of feeling of non-climate justice and high rates of power in an area that also was being gentrified. And so one of the things that New York State has, and other states do too, but state level law, we'll talk about the fragmentation of the energy grid in questions. One of the things that we have is a community solar garden legislation here that allows communities actually to install solar that then winds up benefiting them in the rate that they achieve and in the renewable power that they use. Now, we'll let the panelists describe why it's not that they just directly use that power, and that will be an interesting discussion. But whatever lens you want to look at this through, there's something here for you that you need to understand in order to proceed into the real estate career that you want to have. And then there's a whole other bunch of careers, because obviously all of these assets on the urban-rural continuum need an incredible amount of space in order to generate the energy that is going to replace coal plants and other forms of fossil fuel plants. So with that, I'd love to start disaggregating some of the questions here, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the relationship between local microgrids, community solar, and the utility provided microgrids. Like, what does that look like? How is it different state by state? And if you want to talk a little bit about what it means in New York, if you feel you can, I think that would be an interesting question to kind of kick off how this all relates.
I could take the first stab at that, Matt.
Thanks,
Maybe I'll start by defining what a microgrid is, just at a conceptual level. Many people have their competing definitions for microgrids. One that we see from an analyst that we respect is one, a microgrid is a distributed energy resource that provides the ability for power and energy services in a geographic perimeter in both grid connected and island mode, which we've already spoken about. Another feature that would be expected in a microgrid is the ability to power a single building or multiple buildings for an extended period of time, say more than 24 hours. And lastly, it's a distributed energy resource that can be controlled or dispatched as a single entity. So multiple components working in harmony by a common control system, which is hardware and software. That's both components we specialize in at Scale Microgrid Solutions. So it's control, islanding, and being able to power more than, say, a home. So it's many, many homes. And there are a lot of economic models built around that hardware concept that I think you're kind of alluding to, Matthew, in your commentary. And it could be as simple as, if you build it, they will come. So that's sort of the utility approach to life, which is I have a very special position in the economy, having a monopoly. I'm regulated. And if I put $1 out, I should get between 8 and 12% return on equity for that dollar invested. Outside of that regulated utility world is the build it, and when they're here, kind of, so you sign up with a customer to pay for your electrical infrastructure, and that's in the competitive environment. And there you have, for each of the different components, different potential revenue streams. You might have a revenue stream related to the solar that's being net metered most of the time. You might have a different revenue stream for your battery energy storage system, which could be supporting the grid through frequency regulation.
Sorry,
services.
Can you define net metering just for a moment, since you talked
That's
about
a great question. I think Josh and Aaron touched on that in their slides, but net metering is that interplay between behind the meter and front of the meter. It's where electrons are actually flowing through the meter back onto the grid, which is diametrically opposed to the normal course where customers receive electrical current from the grid. It's net in the sense that at the end of the month, those inward and outward flows are aggregated on the customer's bill. And it's a really important feature of our grid economic system that was established under, I believe it was the EPA Act of 2005. And it has a lot of different flavors, varying state by state. So another thing you touched on, Matt, is geography of where these assets are located plays into the economic model. Is the customer bearing all the costs, or are there rebates or incentives where the social value of grid connected energy is recognized either through in New York, say by like NYSE, or through other governmental or non-governmental entities that have a common vision of reducing greenhouse gases, either to meet state laws or federal mandates. So there's, that's a separate discussion. We could probably spend a whole week in seminar talking about the different economic models, but it's generally around rebates, upfront payments, payments earned over time that incentivize the adoption of these infrastructure assets, generally with the goal of creating more scale, because scale tends to reduce costs in these industries and make a virtuous adoption cycle possible, where more grid connected energy begets more grid connected energy. So I'll take a pause there and let Josh or Aaron opine on your question.
Well, I can maybe just touch on how does the grid across the United States work, and that is a very complicated answer, and in some cases it's almost by design. I mean, it's there's not a singular grid. There's multiple grids operated by regional independent system operators. An example that's been in the news lately is the Texas grid. It's effectively its own region with its own rules. It only pays for energy. It doesn't pay you to just have capacity on standby, which is an interesting feature of that. And so these grids, which can take up pieces of the country like California, New England, and others, they have their own rules. There's a lot of similarities. And right now we've got limited transmission or aging transmission in a lot of cases. So that's a big part of the Biden infrastructure plan, is to increase transmission. And there's a great book that came out from a guy, I think Michael Skelly, who was a developer of a transmission company. I think it's called Superpower, but that's a great read. It's interesting. It's even for this topic, I promise. And what we lack is transmission lines linking high resource areas like wind in Kansas or solar in Arizona to the big load zones in Texas, Los Angeles, and actually Los Angeles is probably better than most. But the point is, you could actually have a lot less volatility and a better access to cheap renewable energy if you had transmission lines connecting these areas of high resource to the areas of high load. So that's one comment on the larger grid. Maybe I'll just touch on community solar. So community solar is pretty neat. It's a fairly recent innovation in the solar space, and it mixes some of the benefits of the utility scale economics with the higher retail electricity rates. And in terms of where it sits on the grid, so this is not behind the meter. It's not sited with the customers. It is still on the larger grid, but rather than being on the big transmission lines, which I would describe as being the artery of the system, it's in some of the large veins, I suppose, the distribution lines that are bringing power. Just so say you might site one right outside of the most expensive Manhattan real estate, and then sell bill credits at a discount to the utility price to the subscribers within Manhattan. So they're getting a discount to their bill because the power is cheap enough to do that these days with solar costs. And NYSE is incentivizing this via a value stack they're calling the value of distributed energy resources, or VDER. And they will actually give a more targeted incentive to a project based on where you site it. So if you're in a distribution part of the network, the grid, that's highly valuable and right outside the most expensive load pocket, you'll get paid for that. And that's a pretty smart and recent innovation.
It's a really interesting point, and I think previously in our prep conversation we were talking about production cost parity. Can you get into that a little bit more? I know you alluded to, Aaron's like, I want to get all over to that, how difficult that macro grid is, and so it's really not a super simple question to answer. But Aaron, you're definitely enthusiastic to get on it.
Yeah. So Josh, I'm going to go a little bit off script here. Don't tell anyone. But these are not my materials. So there's a couple of technology innovations that have really changed how, like, real estate, power generation, and the carbon story. Number one is the cost of LEDs. LEDs have plummeted in cost since 2010. I mean, you can see in the graph on the right, that is a cost curve for LEDs. If you are an owner of real estate, there is no reason every single light in all of your built environment should be an LED. There's no reason at all. So that's technology change number one. This is a chart of a simple payback of upgrades to buildings. So control systems, 3 to 4 years. High efficiency variable feed drive, having a fan spin at a variable speed pays back. LED lights is less than a 2-year payback. So you have a tremendous amount of upgrades to old buildings that pays for itself. So it's cost effective to do all these upgrades. So there's been a tremendous amount of technology improvement in lighting, tremendous amount of technology improvement in HVAC systems, control systems. All of this impacts buildings and how you might either construct one or renovate a new building. This is all reducing carbon, it's all lowering bills, it's reducing cost, all good things. From a technology perspective on solar and wind, these are graphs of Lazard. Lazard is an investment bank, and maybe folks have seen this. I want to point your attention to the graph on the right. When I joined the industry in 2010, solar was $226. You don't necessarily need to know what that means, but today it's less than 36. You've had a tremendous decrease in the cost of solar. I heard someone on the news the other day that said solar was 6 times more expensive than conventional generation. That is false, very false. this is a report produced by the same investment bank. Solar is here in the middle at $36 and $32. Wind is down at $28. And to build something new today in the conventional generation space, it's significantly higher. Solar and wind are cost competitive in almost every state today. So as a power consumer, any corporation, any building, anybody who buys power, you are looking for these numbers. I mean, we have signed power agreements with Microsoft and Amazon and FedEx and Target, and all of these companies are buying power from solar mostly because it's cheaper. That's a drastic change from where we were 5 years ago and 10 years ago.
What's driving that? If I go back, I like this chart. If I go back one slide, that one, what's been driving that down so much?
Scale, just the overall growth. I mean, just like most industries, is the more you produce of something, the better we get at it. You know, wind on the left has seen a drastic decline as well. So, and then storage is going to have the same graph. I mean, storage as electric vehicles grow, as battery technology, that's going to have the same impact. And so when Julian talks about, you know, a customer, you know, could be advantaged to install solar, to put storage, to have these systems installed in their building, it's because it's become cheaper and technology has improved so drastically.
And Aaron, it's a couple different forms of scale, right? Because on the one hand, you have the scale of production of things like photovoltaic cells. Like, it's actually getting cheaper to create the actual equipment. And on the other hand, when we see large scale deployments, it becomes cheaper to install and maintain. And so you have both a capital and a operating advantage. Do you think that this huge investment that New York State is now making in offshore wind is going to have a big effect on the renewable rates that we see in New York?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question. I mean, offshore wind is in its infancy in the US, right? I mean, you know, you'd like to think that as we get better at building ships to install this stuff, that we get better at having turbines that withstand offshore conditions, that the price will come down. I'm a little bit skeptical that it's going to be cost competitive with onshore solar and onshore wind. But it may very well be competitive with you know, with gas or coal. So it may be advantageous to do offshore wind, but I'm personally a big fan of onshore solar, or, you know, of solar, just as costs continue to decline and projects get bigger. But I think offshore is definitely going to be a part of the mix.
You know, one of the things that was said earlier is location matters, right? Because without having those transmission lines that I think Josh maybe mentioned, to connect different areas in New York, the prospect of solar is different than in Arizona or Nevada, where we've done a fair amount of solar. In New York, we have this very shallow continental shelf that goes out, that allows us in a very high wind area to potentially, you know, harvest some of that. So we might see different solutions in different areas based on the cost of transmission as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I want to remind our students, feel free to throw some questions at us. There's a chat box there, and if feel free to message us as well. But I want to build on this a little bit and talk about some of the public sector's recent push, starting at the very top, the Biden administration, their infrastructure bill, and going down to municipal efforts, as Matt had mentioned previously. I think we previously discussed a little bit about the proposed infrastructure bill streamlines and consolidates some of the tax credits for renewables. Are you guys anticipating anything in those bills or other high-level policies having a significant impact on your business?
I think there are a few provisions in legislation, either directly proposed by the Biden administration or by members of Congress, that are provided in parallel to that proposed legislation. For one, Congressman Panetta in California has proposed a microgrid specific tax credit that would mirror in many ways pre-existing legislation that's already in place to incentivize the installation of renewable energy, and it expands it to some of the core equipment that is left behind. So switchgear, control software, and other features that make a microgrid special and a resilient distributed energy resource on site more expensive than a non-resilient standalone solar and battery storage system. That's a very, that could be a real game changer, because oftentimes we see that the microgrid can be a premium product in terms of the customer is really buying insurance. And that is just one more thing to overcome with the customer. It's a lot easier to sell them a product when there's no money down and they're saving 5 to 10% on their utility bill. It's the core selling point that Aaron and Josh were just talking through, that's been driving the LCOE and the acceptance and adoption of these technologies by the marketplace. We want to bring that to the microgrids. So that's one aspect. There's also a tremendous amount of R&D money set aside, or provision for the Department of Energy to explore ways of providing more cost-effective resiliency on the grid and behind the meter for various different end users. And there's a big push for energy equality and equity in the grid connected world. And that's something we also see that's very exciting in the Biden administration's proposed infrastructure spending. And Matt, you mentioned Hunter's Point, or Hunts Point up in the Bronx. That is, an area that has at times been sort of left behind by economic growth. It also is very core to the functioning of the broader New York area. As you mentioned, it's one of the largest food distribution centers. It's very common to see an overlap of disadvantaged economic communities aligning with energy infrastructure that may not make that the best living experience. And so I think there's definitely a push to expand access to better and cleaner energy sources, and sort of balance the balance the siting of this type of infrastructure.
It's really interesting point that you bring up, Julian. A lot of the manufacturing areas have an extraordinary amount of truck traffic that has a huge amount of emissions that affects the people that live close to there. So some of you might know that there have been various protests of locating Fresh Direct warehouses or Amazon warehouses in certain areas because the amount of noise and truck pollution has led to increased areas of asthma and actual, negative effects on people's health. In addition to that, Hunts Point is a location where all of these trucks are going in and out, supplying over 50% of the supply of food to the 5 boroughs goes through that area. And if we were to lose power in that area, we can lose food for the whole, getting food into the city. It's a pretty high stress point. And so over the last few years, this was one of the pieces that fell under my management when I worked for New York City. We actually worked with the Urban Land Institute and with the local community to create a proposed microgrid solution that was partially funded by the federal government in order to both reduce all of those emissions at the same time as provide climate resiliency against flooding. So it's pretty.
You touched on a really important point there. The electrification of everything, so to speak, which is a big part of this energy transition from buildings to transportation, is a really big component of public health. So the emissions from all of these trucks has an impact on low-grade ozone that is very bad for air quality. A microgrid and on-site distributed energy infrastructure is a core component of having electric vehicles from either a last mile delivery standpoint or a municipal transit solution, whether it be for like New York City or various school districts. Replacing diesel or hybrid vehicles with electric only vehicles will make massive improvements. And you do that with the right power infrastructure solution so that you have a reliable service.
One of our students, Sabia, asks, are you seeing an uptick in the use of fuel cells? I'll throw that out there for both of you, all of you.
We see them more regional. There are, this kind of goes back to one of the original things we talked about in this session, which was there's a patchwork of grids and how they're managed. There's a patchwork of incentives, where they come from, federal, state, local, and there's a patchwork of resources. Solar in the Southwest, very strong. In the Northeast, it's a little less strong and less reliable. So those factors play in. There's access to natural gas, which is really important for fuel cells at the moment until hydrogen sort of becomes more readily available to replace or supplant natural gas use as fuel for a fuel cell. But so we see it in very specialized applications, like urban areas, for example. I think there's a big push for fuel cells in New York City. And we've seen some headlines about developments there. But it's a component of a microgrid on the dispatchable side. But that could also be replaced with a diesel genset, which would be your dirtiest option, that has certain physical characteristics that are important and valuable, or a natural gas reciprocating engine that could also generate heat for thermal uses.
Thanks. We didn't really prep on this one. Apologize for a little bit last minute, but my capital markets students would be remiss if I didn't pose a question about cost of capital and the availability of capital to both of your businesses. Since in many respects, you guys are intermediaries, right? There's an arbitrage to be had. Are you seeing a lot more availability of capital coming in to support your businesses, to support the businesses that you guys are investing into, and change in that kind of dynamic and relationship? I think the obvious answer is yes, but
yeah, I would say the renewable energy industry in the U.S. Has been awash in capital for the last couple of years. Now, it's been targeted. There's definitely a haves and have-nots kind of situation, I would say. Tax equity is a big component where that plays out to an extreme level. But there's capital available for development businesses, projects, especially operating projects, even more so. The level of infrastructure fundraising and private equity has been tremendous. And it's been sustained at over $100 billion per year in new funds raised for the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of that infrastructure money is geared towards the low-hanging fruit where it can be deployed, which is the US power generation market. And so I think there's still a lot of work needed for capitalizing more innovative businesses, and that's why the Capital Solutions business at Scale Microgrid Solutions is so important. And but the more plain vanilla mainstream assets are attracting cheaper and greater volumes of capital. That's been my experience. So Josh or Aaron, love to hear your perspective too.
I wish I could say we were seeing less folks chase after the deals that we're looking at, but we have the same experience as you, Julian. I think there was a description of the capital chasing the assets a few years ago that's just remained true, which is that there's a wall, or there's a wall of cash chasing these assets, and somewhere around the lower part of the cost curve that Aaron was showing, the scale of the opportunity also was large enough around that point that institutional investors in the United States and around the world actually, we're starting to come into the market in full force. And so the largest utility scale projects, and increasingly even large portfolios of very small assets, is chased by folks with as attractive a cost of capital as there is. Also, we just fully agree with that. There are pockets that are more constrained, and then those constrain the entire market to some extent. Like tax equity is the clearest. Also, development capital. Not everybody wants to come in early, and so there is some differentiation around how soon you come into a project. Still, I would say, there's always newer assets where there's a lot of innovation in this market. And I think, I would say this isn't a secret sauce by any means, but part of our strategy is that we're looking into new spaces where there's, programmatic investments that kind of meet our MO, and where we can still, earn a premium. And I would say that there are markets that we've been heavily involved in, and then the price is compressed, and we've gotten out of those markets and rotated into something new where the return for a perceived level of risk is superior. And you got to keep working at that for sure.
Just want to say one other thing very quickly. Josh touched on it, and I think there's an important word, which is risk. When you talk about cost of capital, the lower the risk, the lower the cost of capital should be. And when you think about the kinds of assets that we're investing in, a light bulb, an LED light bulb, a solar project, it has no employees, it has no moving parts, it sits there for 35 years. And you compare that to a natural gas power plant, which has thousands of moving parts. It has water, it has fuel, it has permits, it has air permits, it has local residents, it has noise, it has pollution. There are things that add to the risk of those traditional power generating assets that you just simply don't see in solar and energy efficiency. And so the cost of capital for these assets should be lower because there's less risk.
Great point. Great point. They have long lives as well, right? So you get some time scale also.
They do.
Look, I think it's been a great conversation. I appreciate the effort you guys took to prepare material that would be educational, insightful for our students. I know on behalf of them, thank you. Any parting thoughts, or I should say words of wisdom you'd like to impart on our students as we kind of wind down here?
Yeah, I would just say anyone who's thinking about a career in real estate or real assets, I would say it's definitely a marketplace where innovation is rewarded. There's innovation happening on the financial side. There's innovation happening in the economic / business model development side. I think there's, just a coterie of different types of businesses that are all competing across the spectrum. We touched on one of them, but it's definitely, the energy transition market broadly, one of the most interesting and innovative segments of the U.S. economy. So definitely go into it with, eyes wide open and, an open mind, and I think you'll be rewarded.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Look, this has been a great conversation. Hopefully this is the beginning of a long relationship between Hannon and Scale Microgrid Solutions and NYU. Looking forward to sharing the replay with our students. And again, thank you guys for your time. Thanks for attending. Good conversation.